an area that's developed enormously in just the last couple of decades and is continuing to develop so fast, that there are things from that that we can implement that make it more likely that we get the results that we want, that we get the changed behavior that is the point of doing any of this work. And next slide, please, Charlotte. And it's more important now than ever before. We live in a very, very weird world. VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, that does not begin to describe what we have been experiencing since March 2020. And it's not getting better anytime soon. Changes are coming. The pace is going to get faster. The problems are going to get more knotty. Transformation is not going to be an event we go through anymore. It's going to be a continual process, and that is going to cause some hurt because people are going to have to learn to deal with constant change, lots of ambiguity, and all that uncertainty. And organizations, you guys, the L&D guys, are going to have to help them and help them to help themselves. We've got this constant need for transformation now, and we need to support that. And one way that we can do that is through the opportunities that we give people to learn, through the training, through the coaching. Next slide, please. Because as I say, education, developing people is about changing behavior. It's about giving people the knowledge and the skills they need to be able to do things differently, to do them better, to improve performance, giving them what they need so that they can do more of it, do it differently in the pursuit of business goals. Because if it's not that, what is it about? But if it is that, if you can help your people to do things better, then that's successful, because that's the ultimate objective. It's performance. It's not how many people went through the training course or even how much they enjoyed it. It's not even about how many people said they learned something or could prove they learned something. And it's not, good Lord save us, it is not about engagement. Engagement is in many ways a word I would like to see banned from discussions about training, because we talk about engagement when we should be talking about effectiveness. We need to be clearer about that. And do please get in touch and ask me to rant about engagement. It's a good thing, we need it, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is performance, doing better at meeting the business goals, and that is what we're being paid to improve. Next slide, please, Charlotte. We spend lots of money and time and energy on training. We all know it, and we're proud of it. And some of it is great. But do we really believe it all works, that we have a learning culture where people take responsibility for their learning, where they seek out opportunities to develop themselves and others outside of training, where training really sticks? Well, the research suggests not. The problem is that we spend too much time, money, energy sending people who aren't ready, don't need, or can't access the training, and we spend money on things like transport, accommodation, and meals that are important and necessary, or at least they were, but we found out that actually these elements, they might be important for enjoyment, and maybe, you know, being in real life helps with engagement, but it's not clear that any of these things are necessary, or at least not entirely necessary, for behavior change. We know this because our people have continued to learn and develop both functional and soft skills throughout the pandemic. Another problem is that we can't prove our worth. Increasingly, thank goodness, we do spend more time and energy on checking up afterwards that people have actually turned up to training and learned something. And that's important and necessary, but we need to be able to do more than that. We need to be able to prove that the intervention worked. But of course, very rarely does the data we gather do that. So next slide, please, Charlotte. We don't get ROI because we don't focus on performance. This is the holy grail. This is what we need to be able to show. We need to be able to show this return on investment. And how many of us can genuinely prove that? I don't mean showing that test scores have improved or that people know the right answer in a test, but actually point to changed behavior, people doing things differently or better in order to meet those business goals. How many of us even really try? We very rarely see genuine proved ROI when it comes to training. And that may be linked to why it's so frequently the training budget that gets cut when there's pressure on costs. Because if we can't prove it, why should anybody pay for it? Why should they pay for it in the good times, never mind the bad times? We don't see ROI because we don't follow the science. We don't build an accountability and check it's making a difference. We don't focus on performance, in other words. So let me expand a bit on these three things before I get into what I think we can do about it. We don't do what the science tells us. We know what it takes to change behavior, to improve performance, and we do very few of these things in training. Not because we couldn't, but just because we haven't. And we don't build in accountability. People can easily attend most training and not learn anything at all without it making any difference to their professional lives, certainly in soft skills. Not so much when it's about qualifications or Excel. And yet it's the soft skills that impact their career and your culture more than anything else. So how is that allowed? If somebody constantly failed their CFA qualification, ultimately there will be repercussions if that's needed for their job. But if they are constantly bad at delegating, we just let them carry on. So we don't check if we've made any difference to that performance. We talk about ROI and then we don't really do much beyond a smiley sheet or maybe an action plan to make sure that we get that. And I think the pandemic is helping with that. Certainly I'm seeing a little bit more spaced learning, which we'll talk about in a minute. One of those principles of cognitive learning science that is happening almost by default. And I'm starting to see people realize that an 8-hour or a 3-day session in purpose isn't necessarily necessary and may in fact be counterproductive. So let me give you an example. Can I get the next slide, please, Charlotte? A few years ago, I put together a training program. I think Charlotte mentioned it. It's all about helping people to speak up more effectively and listen up more effectively, about healthy conflict. It's good for productivity, innovation, all those good things. I spent a long time putting this together, writing the book. And because I know just how hard it is to make people change behavior, I wanted to make sure they were really supported. So we worked with a neuroscientist on every aspect of this program, even the design of the book itself, the way the words looked on the paper was done to make it easier to absorb that information. And in particular, as you can see on the slide, the format of the training was different. It took into account the things that we know that make a difference to how people learn, remember, and then embed that knowledge so that they can use it in their daily lives, in their professional lives. And it followed the principles I'm going to outline later because it acknowledged that we learn things better when we learn them in smaller sections. And so it was built, as you can see, over 5 days of half days of training, split over approximately 6 months. It incorporated retrieval practice. So in other words, we revisited concepts previously learned and built on this, scaffolding along the way. We had manager and external coach involvement in between the face-to-face sessions because learners had work to do when they went back to the workplace. They submitted projects, they completed tasks in real life, and they got immediate feedback from people whose opinion is actually important, their colleagues and their bosses, not their trainers. And there was peer coaching. So there was a sense of community learning and individuals had to work across functions. So they were building that shared language and that understanding. There were downloadable resources with video, other media to make it engaging and relevant to their specific function, to their industry or to their situation. And it was personalized. We used stretch assignments to allow those who were progressing to quickly to continue and not feel stymied by others. And we also had extra coaching available for those who needed it and needed more support. We also captured examples of learning and how people had changed their behavior so that the people paying for the program would not only know that there was a change from what the learners told them, but also from what the people around them said, from those stakeholders. In short, next slide, please, Charlotte, it was my pride and joy. And the organizations who did this, they got genuine ROI. In other words, a really obvious impact. The people who attended the training, they were supported, they were challenged, the reasons behind the format and the structure and the tasks were explained, and they became genuine partners in their learning. They took accountability, they were engaged, and they learned it and they used it in their daily lives. But to do this, we needed to blend the training. We needed to meet in real life and then go online. And there was resistance to this at the time. There was resistance, next slide please, Charlotte, to shorter, more focused trainings, to doing that work in between the formal training, to getting managers involved, to the learning science. There was even resistance to taking some time to proving that learners had learned something and made a change in their behavior, even though we all know that we need to be able to show value for money spent. And those organizations that resisted, they still did the training, but they watered it down. So the results were watered down too. People still enjoyed it. They got a lot out of it. But because of that resistance to change, they and their organizations didn't get out of it what they could have done. At least some of their time, and so money and energy and goodwill was wasted. And some of that resistance is gone now because of COVID, right? We can never, what's the word? We should never waste a good crisis. Which I'm not saying COVID was a good thing, don't get me wrong. But there is an understanding that training doesn't have to be now as it always was. But have you noticed there's a lot of very bad online training, truly bad. You guys know this, right? And my concern is that the bad training that we've seen online will stop us taking on the good things about virtual and asynchronous training or development tools. And that even though most of us are moving back to a hybrid workplace, we're still resisting incorporating what really needs to make things stick, a hybrid approach to training and development. And I think I know why. And in fact, after some recent conversations, talking to potential clients and old clients and looking at some of the comments on here, I think I know why. So if we can have the next slide, please. The problem, my friends, is that in order to take this blended approach to actually do all the things that we know make a difference to learning means a few things have to happen. And one big thing, which is commitment. It's not the commitment of you guys, the L&D people or the trainers, it's the commitment of the learners and the managers. Learners had to be committed to make this work. They had to be committed to practice and reflect and feedback and repeating until they got change. And managers had to be committed. They had to be involved. They had to start by explaining the gap between the performance that they were getting and the performance that they wanted. They had to help us by supporting the change and reporting back to the learner and the person in charge of training, in many cases you guys, the L&D people, what was going on. And these were the real downfalls. Not when we did it in real life, but to people starting it to begin with. With clients, whether speaking with L&D or senior leadership, the problem was, yeah, but what if they don't want to? What if the learners don't want to? And what if the managers don't want to? So assuming that we have good content, well delivered, and the learners are supported by the trainer, it was the learners and the managers and their lack of commitment that was the problem. And that's a big problem, because without it, you're wasting your time. And unless you let them, your trainers, whether internal or external, help you build in that commitment, then you're going to continue wasting your time. Cheerful, huh? So changing behavior is hard. It's not hard on paper, but it's hard in reality. And we know that. We know that from trying to lose weight or give up smoking or give up the habit of rolling our eyes every time our spouse does that annoying thing. This is all bad news. But next slide, please. There is good news. And the good news is we know how to do this. We know how to really change behavior. We know how the brain works, or a lot more than we used to. And we can build in commitment. We can make training better. We can reduce the time, energy, and money wasted, not just ours, but our organizations and our learners. So how? Next slide, please. How can we really support this behavioral change when we're going to need to face this new normal, the next new normal, and the one after that? We're going to look at 5 steps, and the 4th is where I'm going to focus most of our time today, but I want to look at the 5 to get us an overview. So number 1, we need to work out what the behaviors are that we need. I cannot tell you how many people I've had turn up on a course with no idea why they're there. They can't make a direct link between the content and the objectives of the training program and their job or performance, and that is crazy. It's a waste. Training has to be tied to a business goal, and the performance goals of the individual have to be connected to that. We need to start by getting the managers and the individual learners involved. It's not enough for them to say, tick a box and say, I want training on Excel, or I want training on a communication skills. It's not reasonable to think that you or any training provider could possibly create something that's likely to be useful if they're not going to give us more information than that. And if they're refusing to give us the time to give us that information, are they really going to spend the time trying to embed that information? Instead, we need managers to do their jobs, to manage the performance of their people, to develop their people. And part of that is being able to explain adequately what they want the training to achieve. What changes do they want to see? And if your managers can't tell you what their direct reports need to get better at in detail with examples, then that's worrying, surely. And if they don't want to, that's another problem. So not every function or industry or organization is going to be facing the same issues. We need to be specific about the problems we're trying to fix, the gaps we're trying to help people to cross, what success will look like. Because if we don't, we can't achieve it. And I know it takes time, it does. But taking one day and getting something useful that's worth your time, energy, and money has to be better than taking 1 hour and getting something pointless, something that at best will make a small difference. So let's look at our second step. Our second steps is about using our KPIs. So whatever your performance management system is, however it is that people know what they're supposed to do, we should be connecting that to the trainer, to the behaviors that we're focused on developing in this intervention. The managers or the learners should be able to put those behaviors or the results of them in the KPIs, telling people where they are now and where they need to be. Being forced to be specific about how the training should impact on performance focuses minds. And this is common sense, but it is not common in reality. In fact, in reality, it's distressingly common to be told that people don't have KPIs at all, and yet still be expected to produce a meaningful ROI. If we don't know what return we want, if we don't know what impact we're looking for, we have little hope of success. And training alone isn't enough to even get that success. We need to educate for these behaviors. Training is part of it. Moving on to step 3, but it's not it. It can't be just training. Even if you do everything right, if we do everything right, the managers do everything right, it won't be enough. We need to think about the other options too, mentoring, on-the-job support, which is a whole other subject. But all of this can and should be built into the overall training plan with whoever is delivering your training, which brings us on to number 4, using the science. And I cover this briefly and we'll go into a lot more detail, but we know what it takes to make training sticky. It's not the content it's not engagement, in other words, how much people enjoy it, although it's important, We need to make training programs that we deliver more likely to help people to use what they've learned, how we deliver it. So, for example, having repeated low stakes testing helps to increase retention, but it also changes the attitude and mindset of the learner, as does knowing that whether or not you complete a task will have an impact on how you're seen by your boss or your colleagues, and perhaps may have an impact on the results that they can achieve. But learners need support beyond the format of the training, beyond anything an external or even an internal provider can offer, and that's the support they get from their manager. If their manager has made it clear why this learner is doing a particular program, if they've explained what they expect to change and improve, if they've built it into the KPIs, then guess what? The lady attending the training is more likely to pay attention, more likely to use what they've learned in real life, more likely to change their behaviors. And I will talk about both of those, the manager and the learning science, just as I promised, in a few minutes in more depth. But finally, that fifth step in changing behavior is one I think we miss a lot, and that's selling the difference that we make. From the first step to the final outcomes, we have so many opportunities to sell the services that you're offering to your customers, the learners and their managers. And I don't see us doing that as often as we could do or as effectively as we could do. We don't sell the value to the managers, and even if we remember to sell it to the learners, we reduce that value by not getting their commitment, by not making it clear that they may have to work at this too, and by positioning extraneous things like the food or the comfiness of the chair as important as the real point of the intervention, changing behavior. I'm not saying they're not important. Like a good buffet lunch myself, miss them a lot, but they're not as important as everything else. And that's so important, we could talk about it all day, but I want to focus on the fourth step, which is on our next slide, please, Charlotte, and it's about using the science to make it sticky. So how do we use the science to not change the format, but the structure, to change how we deliver that training so learners are committed and supported to change their behaviors. But changing is hard. They need that help beyond what we can deliver. And luckily, if we follow the science, it's easier to incorporate the managers. It's easier to show them how they can get what they really want, that better performance. And this is a big deal because, next slide, please, Charlotte, managers are crucial. They are key to us getting a real ROI, both a return on investment and that really obvious impact. And this may be controversial, they're more important than us. Go back, please, Charlotte, thanks. Yeah, they're more important than us. They're more important than L&D. They're more important than HR. They're more important. And way too often, they are not fans of training, especially in anything that's not directly related to the functional, hard skills. Again, despite these being crucial to career success and results, and just generally getting things done. Too often our managers see this as a waste of time or a reward for a job well done or a nice day out. So what's happening there? Why aren't they fans? They should love us. They believe that their people need help to communicate, to present, to influence, to delegate, whatever, but they don't often believe the training works, or rather they often don't believe the training works. They often don't see any change. And why is that? And I think it's because we don't support them as much as we need to. And by all means, let me know if you think that's controversial. And more importantly, and perhaps even more controversial, I don't think we ask enough about them. I don't think we ask enough of them. Remember what I said earlier? The most common pushback is against following the sciences. Oh, well, the managers won't show the commitment. They won't do the work necessary. This seems crazy to me. They are responsible for the performance of their teams and need to ensure that they maximize the contribution from each team member. That is their job. It is not yours. But too often it feels like developing people is something L&D do, and the manager might sometimes help with. So the average organization, when dealing with managers, what do? We send them a training need analysis, not really connected to the real world. They tick a few boxes and we never ask them about it again. We take their people away for training, often with nebulous objectives at best, certainly not necessarily related to the performance of the job that the manager needs the employee to do and that the organization is paying for, and we very rarely follow up until the next TNA, or maybe very rarely the performance review, which could take place up to 12 months later. And if we do follow up, it's a quick, are you happy? In other words, we take the same smiley sheets that we use with learners and we use something similar and similarly fairly pointless with the managers. And it's a problem because we need these guys. Next slide, please. They support behavioral change. In other words, they are the people, possibly the only people, that can create and report back on that ROI, that really obvious impact. So rather, they can make the return on investment really obvious. But we don't teach them how to do that. We don't teach them how to support behavioral change. And in fact, we rarely even ask them to. I mean, Beyond completing a TNA, what else do we do to get managers to support the behavioral change that we've spent all this time, energy, and money on? And by all means, if you guys are doing something better, please tell me. Tell me in the comments or get in touch at the end. I'd love to hear it because I could do with some good news. But we could ask them to support by doing things like having a conversation with their employee about what they learned, creating a project designed to test that new skill or behaviors, confirming a survey confirming that they're happy, and asking for some examples of that behavioral change. And that last one is important, right? Because we need to get them involved in reporting the difference, the changes, the ROI. And that helps to sell it to them, excuse me, by asking them to come up with examples before and after that formal training. They notice the difference. And we can use those anecdotes, those examples, those case studies, because in our world, the plural of anecdote is data when it comes to behavioral change. We can use these stories in our reporting. So what stories have we got? What stories could we be telling right now about the changes that we've made to our stakeholders? And if we don't have any, wouldn't having some make our lives easier, better? And we can't expect managers to do this off their own bat. They're busy, right? And we can't even expect them to know how to do this. Most managers get given the job of managing others, not because they know how to do it or even want it, but because they perform a certain role well and they want advancement. Unfortunately, the role they excelled in is no longer theirs, and performing it well is not their job anymore. Their job now is to get people to perform better, to change their behavior. And the problem is they don't know how to do this, even if they're expected to explicitly. And as we've seen, that's rare for them to be expected to do it explicitly. So we need to give them a framework and support. Can we get the next slide, please? Beyond the ideas I've already mentioned around, asking them, we need to help the managers to improve performance directly, to educate their people. Because being able to educate, being able to instruct, inspire, and motivate is the job of a manager. And I have noticed that we spend a lot of time in helping them how to inspire and motivate, and we spend very little time teaching them how to educate, to instruct, to teach, to train, which is weird because in many cases that's what they want to do, and it's what their people want, and it's what their organization wants. And if we could get people learning and improving their performance, maybe they wouldn't need all the motivation. They need skills. The managers need skills to support on-the-job training, or as I've learned to call it recently, job-embedded professional development. We need to skill them so they can actually do what we want them to do. We can call it teaching, coaching, mentoring, training. I don't care. I know I should, but I don't. And neither does the person going through the experience or the person paying for it, because the goal, whatever the process, whatever we call it, the goal is the same: performance. It's about making sure that people perform better, that relationships are enhanced, that work is less stressful, that the focus is on the performance, not on the promotion, not on the job grade, and that responsibility is placed where it should be, with the person performing the business role, not the trainer, not L&D, and not, assuming the manager is doing their job right and performing and providing the support, the manager, the person performing the role. And surely we want that. Of course we do. We want individuals to take responsibility for their own learning. We want to work in a learning culture. But perhaps counterintuitively, that involves making the managers take responsibility too. We have to help them to do this, but next slide, please. It has to be the expectation that they will. It is their job. Managing and developing people is a large part of any manager's role, and not all of them see that. So sometimes when I say support, I mean something more like force, or at least push or nudge. People are busy. They've got immediate and urgent things that will always take precedence unless we change that. And changing behavior, whether at a manager level or their people, is a change program. It's like any other. So we need to understand what needs to change. We need to communicate that. We need to support them. We need to identify and remove the obstacles. We need to get the managers involved. And we have to acknowledge that they are busy and distracted by other priorities. We need to put this higher on their agenda by rewarding them for doing it, making it easier by taking away those obstacles. And do we make it clear that we expect them to do this? How many managers have this on their KPIs? And all of this that's true for managers is also true for all the other colleagues, the peers, the senior leaders. They can be involved too. The more involved, the better, because it takes a village. So managers need support, they need help, they need motivation, because we cannot develop people without their managers who can and do efficiently instruct, who can communicate knowledge and skills. And by changing the format of the training, by incorporating these learning principles that we're going to look at right now, I promise, we can harness that power. We can make it easier for everybody. It builds in that commitment for the managers and the learners by giving them real structure, opportunities to practice in the real world, with chances to reflect, to go back, to ask for help, to see real change. And yeah, it takes more time up front at least, and it takes more commitment, but why is that wrong? Isn't it better to spend a bit more time and energy and actually get the results that we want? We have high expectations of everything else we spend money on. So why not this? We know a lot now about how we learn, and we know, therefore, how to teach better. Some of this has been known for a long time, some much more recently, and we're still learning new things all the time. But there is a genuine revolution happening in education, and I don't think we're seeing it in corporate environments yet. And I think it's a scandal, given the resources involved. So let me give you an example. Could I please get the next slide, Charlotte? How many of us recognize this, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve? How many of us in L&D recognize it? I'm hoping it's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. How many of our learners, however, know what it is? And how many of our training programs refer to it and explain how to avoid it? And if I were a betting woman, which I am not, I'd be prepared to bet quite a lot that this is a low number. And yet, this is our enemy. This forgetting curve is our enemy. And a lot of what we're trying to do in training is to reduce this. A lot of what our learners are trying to do, often ineffectively, is reduce this. Just to remind us, the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus found that roughly 70% of memory is lost within the first 24 hours, if no attempt is made to retain it. And we've known this for over a century, and yet we make very little attempt to deal with the problem. And it's not difficult to. So with Hard Talk, the program I told you about earlier, we worked with the neuropsychologist, Professor Art Cohn. And we created these things called boosters, which are a specific type of questions that you deliver at specific intervals after the training, designed to flatten the forgetting curve by using a technique called retrieval practice, which is one of our 6 principles. So with no further ado, let's go in and look at these 6 principles. Next one for me, please, Charlotte. So each one of these 6 principles is based on what cognitive science tells us works to help people remember and so change. So we're going to look at the first one first, and we'll just keep going. So give me the first slide, please, here, Charlotte, retrieval practice. So retrieval practice is all about bringing learned information to mind from long-term memory. So usually when we think of tests or quizzes, we're thinking of them about them from the point of view of assessment. Sorry, Charlotte, just show me all of them, it's fine. We're doing it, we think of quizzes and tests about assessment. Sorry, yeah, show me all the, that's it. Thank you, Charlotte. Where am I? Yeah. So when we think of tests or assessments, we're thinking them when we think of tests, we're thinking about assessment, but don't. For retrieval practice, think of it differently. Testing is shown to strengthen memory. So by testing more, you're helping people to learn more. And there's been a surge of research on this in the last decade or so on the benefits of testing or retrieval practice. And it's been shown to improve the application of knowledge to new situations, which is certainly something we want, right? And when we pair that with scaffolding, it can become really, really useful for higher order learning. And again, it doesn't matter if people get the answers wrong. As long as we explain why it's wrong and what the correct answer is, it has great benefit, not just for the learners, but also for the trainers, because they can then adjust their teaching. And as we touched on earlier, the research done in 2014 showed that when people are expecting to be tested, guess what? They get better at taking on and encoding new information. So low stakes testing or retrieval practice is one element that we can build into training super easily, but that's only one of the 6. So let's look at the next one. The next one is spaced practice. So spaced practice is also sometimes called distributed practice. And that's about returning many times with periods of time in between to the same subject matter. So according to one expert, a guy called Kang in 2016, he says that that the difference that this makes to learning is one of the strongest contributions that cognitive psychology has made to education. In other words, doing this by itself will already make a difference. And this is easy to do. So what we're doing here is we're taking the same amount of repeated studying of the same information, but we're spacing it out over time. And that leads to greater retention. In other words, compared to repeating the same thing again and again in one study session, split it out over different sessions. And it's super, super easy to do this if you have genuine partnerships with your providers and you've planned the learning in advance. So for example, you could have a long blended journey with repeated reviews and exercises related to earlier learning, scaffolding appropriately, or you could have a group of programs that a cohort could work through with topics being revisited in different situations. For example, listening skills in influencing, listening in leadership, listening in negotiation. So now we know that testing, retrieval practice after training, and we know that we need to repeat the same concepts with space in between, space practice. And both of these are relatively easy to incorporate in our world. So what else do we learn from the cognitive science? Give me the next slide, please. Interleaving. So the third practice that we see here, interleaving, is a practice that the science tells us makes a difference to retaining learning and so seeing behavior change. This is about switching between topics while studying. So it's about tackling different ideas or different problem types in a sequence, as opposed to the same kind of problem again and again and again. The other way you can do this is interleaving study, test. So giving people questions to answer and then sharing a correct answer or a worked example. And we can also mix questions on current and previous materials, which takes care of spacing and retrieval practice as well. And honestly, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between spacing and interleaving. So there's our first three. We've got two more, which are concrete examples and elaboration. And these come together quite nicely. So concrete examples are our next slide. This is about when we're studying these abstract concepts. For example, if we're talking about making people feel psychologically safe because you want them to tell you things, right? So it's a very abstract concept, but we can illustrate these with specific examples, and that makes a real difference to how people understand and remember. Not only giving these concrete examples, but perhaps as importantly, having students reflect and develop their own examples, which again, if you're doing spaced learning and you're spreading it all out over time, you can do. It's also true that as novices or people new to a concept or skill, we often notice the surface details rather than those underlying structure. And so we're not as good as we can be at seeing the similarities between two situations. And that has an impact on our ability to transfer skills we've learned in one to another. So combining multiple concrete examples with elaboration, as we're about to see, and having learners explain how those two examples are similar and what that means can really help them to take something that they've learned in one environment and use it elsewhere. Bringing us on nicely to elaboration. So elaboration, next slide please, Charlotte, is about getting learners to ask and explain why and how things work. In other words, it's about getting people to process information at a different level a deeper level in terms of meaning. This involves connecting new information to pre-existing knowledge, which we need, and integrating it with existing knowledge structures, which we also need. So you might, for example, if you're a trainer in this scenario, you might present learners with a situation and ask them to come up with a set of questions. Particularly how and why, and then try to answer those questions themselves based on their existing knowledge. In this scenario, it's really important that the answers are checked, that the learner gets to check their answer and understands what they've done wrong, because if not, you can do more harm than good. Which is also true of our final practice. And this is less about the way the training is delivered and more about the presentation of the materials itself. And that's dual coding. So the next slide, please, Charlotte. And dual coding is about combining words with visuals so that the sum is worth more than the parts. We all know the old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words, which, by the way, I looked up, and it comes from an advertising slogan from the 1920s. And so dual coding theory suggests that sharing the same information in different ways, for example, in writing and a picture, enhances learning and memory. It is a tricky one to get right, though, because each representation, so a picture, a piece of text, an audio tape to listen to, each one of those increases cognitive load and so can lead to people being oversaturated. So there are rules to making this work. And just as an aside, and this will be controversial, hold on to your hats, this is not the same as learning styles. Learning styles, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, is the idea that people have preferences in learning. Preferences. And we should teach them that way because that's the way they get the most out of it. Many people believe this. Many people believe they have a particular learning style, but there is literally no evidence for this. None. There is no evidence that using a preferred learning style leads to an improvement in learning. In fact, it's considered an urban myth in the psychological world. It doesn't mean that people don't prefer it. They do, and the research shows that they feel they're learning more, but there's no evidence for it in performance. Which brings us back to why we're here. Are we here? Are our jobs about giving people a nice day out, an interesting hour or two, a chance to bond with people from other parts of the organization? Maybe. These aren't bad things to want to achieve, but if that's the objective, we can probably do better than training to get us there. If, on the other hand, we care about performance, then we need to at least consider how we can use what the science is telling us and how we can use these 6 specific cognitive strategies that have received robust support from decades of research, how we can incorporate space practice, interleaving, retrieval practice, elaboration, concrete examples, and dual coding. Because, next slide please, Charlotte, we know that we don't learn much in an event, or if we do, we forget, and we return to the norm or the status quo very rapidly. Instead, we need to learn little and often. We need lots of opportunities to practice and get feedback. We need that to happen over time with the chance to reflect and embed one thing before moving on to the next. And then we need to ensure that we apply this to the real world to see what changes are needed in our approach. We need a variety of activities to ensure that the content is presented at the right time and is relevant to the lives of the participants, because the more relevant it is, the more it will be retained. And we also need to make it difficult, deliberately, the right kind of difficult. Researchers who study neuroscience, psychology, and education have reached what may be a surprising conclusion, and that is that infusing training with strategic difficulties and challenges dramatically improves the learner's long-term retention. So we need to do that. We need to present learners with scenarios that are real, where there are ambiguities, there are different potential approaches, and we need to ask them to apply principles. They need to be challenged by the facilitator, by their fellow participants, to apply these principles in real life, because feedback is a vital part of a real learning journey. Participants share and they receive feedback from one another, as well as their facilitator and their managers, over and over and over again, which again helps to embed the skills and the behaviors. We have to move away from bullet points. We need to use stories to add depth, to add spice to the content, because our brains remember through narrative. And if we do all of this, we will see change. We will see the results everybody wants and is working for. And yet, are we doing them? Next slide, please, Charlotte. Most of us aren't. So why? Why aren't we doing this? The advantages to me seem to be clear. People learn. They learn relevant things. Performance improves. Learners are happier. Managers are happier. You get ROI. You can prove that there's a return on the investment by showing the really obvious impact. And an extra benefit is that over time, exposing learners to good practice on how to learn reduces that need for further official training, because we develop their confidence over time. That's not possible in a one-day training, but we can do it over time. It also underlines your commitment to being a learning organization. So why are we doing it? It's hard work, but we're already doing a lot of hard work, and we're doing a lot of hard work without a huge amount of difference a lot of the time. Managers and learners push back. Well, okay, but yeah, they do. We need to educate our customers. We need to explain to them why these changes are necessary. And it needs to be about the bottom line. It can't be about whether or not people are going to enjoy it more. It has to be about whether or not they're going to learn more, whether we're going to see the change in performance that you guys are paying for. And on that note, I will ask Charlotte to go to the final slide. If you want to get in touch with me, guys, please do. I've got all of my details there, and I've just put them through on the chat as well. And do feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll happily send you slides and anything else. Otherwise, I will be quiet and I will hand it back to Charlotte and Dafina. Oh, and I will also go and look at all your chat box things, because I've missed all of this.
Thank you so much, Dawn. That was quite information packed in there. And we will be sending you the slides directly, so don't worry about that. You'll get them as you receive the email notifications of the session starting. So we've got 2 minutes for questions and answers, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Everyone participating today, is there anything that stood out for you? Do you have any specific questions around learning styles, different methods that Dawn has shared, or perhaps you disagree with some of the points that she has mentioned? I always say that silence is not a bad thing when you're waiting for people to drop answers, but it is a little bit uncomfortable.
I'm just reading the notes on the chat box, so you all crack on and do what you want. Charlotte, you're breaking up. We can't hear you.
Yes, Charlotte, you're breaking up pretty bad. We can't hear you really.
Charlotte, we can't hear you at all. I put it in. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So good. Great question. Great question around ROI. No. Charlotte, we can't hear you at all. So type, please. I can see a question from Brian around ROI, and it is hard. But the reason it's hard, guys, is because we don't do the work at the beginning. If they say at the beginning, oh, you know what, we want them to get better at presentation skills, then how do we prove they've got better at presentation skills? I want to know what the problem is that we're solving, what the gap is that we're trying to fix, and then we can go back onto the to finding the proof. But we've got to start from the beginning. What are the behaviors we're concerned about? I've got loads of additional resources that I can share with you guys. Absolutely. The best thing to do is just get in touch with me on LinkedIn or via those things, and I'll send them to you. The proof can take a while, but again, it depends what you're trying to do, and it depends how you set it up, right? So imagine we're doing hard talk and we've done the first half day out of 5 half days. There is no way at the end of that first half day you're going to have ticked all the boxes that you want ticked and you're going to have all the things that you want done. But if we know that one of the reasons that manager A sent participant B on that program is because participant B consistently loses their minds in meetings and either shouts or retreats entirely, then we can, if we're doing something in the first session that impacts on that, then we can start to see that impact immediately. But if we don't know that that's what the guy wants to see, then we have no hope of doing it. It is tough. It is absolutely, absolutely tough to get them to be committed. But honestly, forgive me, but I roll my eyes a little bit. Like, what do we think their job is? What do they think they're managing if it's not their people? Managing people sucks. We all know that, right? That's why we get paid more money for doing it. If managing people was easy and fun, we wouldn't have to pay people more to do it. So that's the answer. It's your job. Yeah, it is difficult to quantify in monetary terms, which is why I come back to again and again and again, the plural of anecdote is in this scenario data. And if you want to, we can you can always go back and do any kind of regression analysis you like and start coming up with numbers. I guarantee you BCG and those guys will do it for you. Happy to take your money, but it will take time and energy. That's the problem. Yeah, okay, so there's a great question from Isha about how do you get the senior leadership in? And it's a really big problem. I mean, let's not pretend otherwise. It is a big problem. I was invited the other day to do an event, and they told me that they had, I think, 8 companies in the group, and that all of the CEOs and the senior leadership teams of all the companies were involved, and they were completely behind this D&I initiative. And would I please come along and speak on this D&I initiative? And I said, sure, I'd be delighted. I expect all the CEOs to be on the call. And they went, what do you mean? And I said, well, you told me they're all 100% behind it, so obviously they can give up an hour of their life to be on the call. And they said, oh, no, they can't guarantee that. We'll ask them. And I said, well, okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, though. I'm going to guarantee you something. If I'm on that call and they're not, I'm going to call them out for it in front of all of your people, because it's nonsense. It's just nonsense. If they're not prepared to put the time in, stop taking their money, guys. It's a waste. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Dawn. And I think that the question on the ROI is the one that comes up a lot all the time. And so I see Brian's comment on sometimes quantifying ROI for saved time in their role is not revenue generating. Would you say that then the ROI comes from the productivity or looking at the team rather than looking at the individual save time? Or
well, again, it comes back to why are we doing this? What problem are we trying to solve? So without naming any names, and I think they might actually be on the call today, but I had a call this morning with somebody who told me that they were putting all of their junior people through a particular program. And I went, why? Do you need them to do this particular behavior? And they said, no, we don't. And I said, so why are we putting them through the training? What are we doing with our time? I mean, I'm not a bazillionaire, but I don't want to take your money and do a bad job anymore. It's a waste of time. Can we start if we only do 2 things, can we do 2 things? 1, can we split up learning over time to give people a chance to think about it and try and implement what we're teaching them? And 2, can we work out what it is we're trying to teach them and why before we do that? If we could do those 2 things, I reckon 60% of the money lost would be gone.
Absolutely. And I think we do work with a number of organizations that have very strategic L&D, that works with a senior leadership team, that have a strategy in place and that make it over time. But we have to say it is not the majority of roles, and it can be frustrating for L&D professionals as well to not work in organizations where that's enabled.
But also for their managers. It's also frustrating for the managers because they're not getting what they think they're getting. And it's frustrating for the individuals because they're not getting it either. They're not changing their performance. It's miserable for everybody. Jen has asked a really good question. What about the idea of subscribing to a platform on a huge variety of trainings? So I have a very funny story about this from a few years back where I was in with a client and they asked us to do a particular piece of training. And I said, well, why are we doing that? It's already on the, on the platform. And it was an asynchronous piece of training on the platform. And she said, oh, no, but sorry, I've told the story wrong. I can't remember how it came out, but anyway, she told me about this. And I said, so how many people use it? And she said something like 0.3% of their employees use this unbelievably expensive bells and whistles platform. And I said, well, okay, if it's that small, why are you doing it? Why are you wasting money? And she said, and I promise you this is true, she said, oh, we're not wasting money. We save a fortune. And I said, how do you save a fortune? By paying for something that's not worth anything that nobody's using? And she said, well, imagine this. Somebody comes along and says, hey, I want to go on a really expensive negotiation skills course to Harvard. And you say, okay, no problem, but you have to do the 3 hours on the platform first. And if they don't do the 3 hours, you never have to pay for them to go to Harvard. And that happened most of the time. So guys, I hear you. I mean, I hear you. But if we're not sending them to Harvard to waste money, why are we sending them down the road to waste money?
One to think about. Anyways, we talk about, and that brings us back to Defina, who I'd like to call back on camera. That brings back to both the CIPD and ICS Learn work. We have developed a number of asynchronous and synchronous training, but at the end of the day, if you do opt in, and that's true when they call you, Dawn, or when organizations call on us. If you do call on us for a piece of training or on any provider, it has to be as part of a wider strategy, and it has to be embedded and give the opportunity for learners to apply it, to go back to the managers, to give recommendations, etc. Otherwise, no matter how great the training, it will just go down the drain. So thank you so much for all these examples and for your passion, Dawn, as usual. I hope we've answered most of your questions. You will be receiving again the presentation. The recording will be available on demand because I do know that was a lot to take in from Dawn. And of course, please feel free to connect with Dawn Metcalfe on LinkedIn and with ICS Learn. Defina, would you like to share a few last words perhaps on how organizations can contact you and how you can help this HR? Oh, I see all the clapping from people. That's lovely. We now know how to use online platforms.
Do that. I don't know how to do that.
I don't either.
Everyone. I just wanted to say that everyone who attended today, you will receive an email from us with the presentation and the recording and our contact details. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Feel free also to get in touch with Dawn. She's there to help you as well. And Dawn, thank you very much for this session. It was very informative and very eye-opening. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I did say on LinkedIn that I was going to get stroppy. I hope it wasn't too stroppy.
It's okay. That's what we call you for. We call you for the thought-provoking and challenging views that you always present. So thank you, everyone. This webinar was presented as part of a collaboration with ICS Learn. It's also part of our year-long series that we launched during the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak. We do have a number of free 1-hour webinars coming up as well. So feel free to subscribe to us on Eventbrite or check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook or whatever platform you find us on. And we are on CIPD.ae. Thanks. Have a great end of week, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.